legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host, Greg Moffat. The first part of the show is free. To listen to part 2, visit legalize-freedom.com and scroll down the homepage to choose your membership. My guest today is Paul Sutton. Popular culture, TV, films, literature, both reflect society and influences it. In an increasingly repressive and woke artistic world, is fantasy now the style best suited to commentary on the so-called real world, where political correctness dominates discourse at the expense of freedom of speech? Where we once had cutting satire to ridicule politics, religion, academia and the arts, and so on, we now have more subtle and supposedly safer forms of subversion, which seem to reflect a general retreat into unreality in our day-to-day lives. Identity politics, online safety acts, and hate speech laws have muted millions for fear of castigation or even criminalization, and creativity is suffering as a result. Hello and welcome, Paul, and thank you so much for joining us once again on legalizefreedom.com.
Well, it's a real pleasure again to talk to you, Greg. Absolutely great. Really glad to be here.
Lovely. So today we're going to be talking about fantasy realism, realistic fantasy. If that doesn't get people interested, I don't know what will. We'll be looking at pop culture and literature and various dimensions, how that overlaps with the real world. Before we get started, tell for listeners who don't know, just give them a little bit of background about yourself, and then maybe set the scene for our talk today.
Okay, yeah. Well, I've done a few before with Greg. I'm a poet, writer, ex-English teacher who left teaching in 2022 after about 18 years in it due to all the woke restrictions. That term's become a bit cliched, but the increasingly authoritarian nature of our so-called liberal society, which is now in decay and collapse on all sorts of fronts. And in fact, that links in with what I want to talk about, or what I want to talk with Greg about today, and how that's being reflected partly from watching a recent TV series that was a hit, but it's been in my mind for a bit. But I do kind of a mixture of political commentary, but also try and be completely free in my use of fantasy, and hyper reality is the thing I love doing. In what it's been, I suppose, poetry, but it's very I don't know what the word would be, but it's not meant for a kind of sense of transcendence necessarily. But yeah, so that's my background. Ex-English teacher, now full-time writer, really. 61, originally studied science at university and actually worked in industry, then went into teaching when I was 40 and loved it, but it increasingly, anything in the public sector now is positively Orwellian. So, yeah.
It is, yeah. So set the scene for our talk, because you mentioned to me this TV series, Small Profits, that had fired your mind, and I haven't seen it, but a couple of terms I saw in the description of it that intrigued me were alchemy and basically the idea of thought forms, or tulpas, or a golem, this like created being.
Well, I wrote a review of it on my Substack, and I was delighted to get you going, oh God, that's great, sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
And I like Mackenzie Cook, who wrote it, and I particularly, everyone will know him from The Office. He's the appalling character Gareth. But he's a very interesting writer, actually. And he, for me, became very interesting with Detectorists, which is beautiful use of kind of male obsessions and stuff, but also has a lot of kind of mythology and links into the fantasy. But this is very different. And what really appealed to me about this was the use of a completely suburban, bland, boring environment for a very fantasy-based thing. So it's set. What I loved about it was the opening episode. It's got 6 episodes. Features a character who's the classic kind of complete failure, really, guy who works in a huge, great DIY superstore in an absolutely appalling, boring job. And his boss is Mackenzie Crook, who plays the kind of nightmare managerial type character, going up and down aisles, checking on whether the varnish is. And this character, Michael, is very, very sort of angry, but also funny. And so it's a comedy partly, but the comedy's really tightly controlled in it. And he's got a massive hinterland, you can see. He lives in a very very overrun semi in a bland suburb of what seems to be Manchester. I think it is Manchester. And he's got a neighbour who's kind of very pernickety and is furious about his overgrown garden. And the character in it is a huge, great beard. He looks like something from a kind of the kind of psychogeographer or something like that. And there's clearly something in his background. And then you quickly realise that he's suffering a loss because his partner walked out on him on Christmas Eve a few years ago, and he had no contact whatsoever. So it's also got that link, the anomie of the missing person, which is a massive increasing feature in our culture, actually. In fact, I've just read a really good detective story based on that, which I'll talk about later as well. And his father, played by Michael Palin, unrecognisable as Michael Palin, I thought, brilliantly, is in a care home, and he's visiting him. And his father hints at, he keeps mentioning his ex-girlfriend, not wife, who has gone missing, just walked out on him. Not after an hour or anything, apparently, but you're slowly led into this. And his father, Michael Palin, is living in a care home, and that's brilliantly done as well. My mum and dad both ended up in care homes, and particularly my mum, it's very like the one she was in. But his father's completely eccentric, and he is kind of hinting at his obsession earlier with someone he met in the Far East who was managing to create these small prophets, these homunculi. And the man Michael says, "Oh, I remember them." He says, "No, you need to do it because you can get in contact with his ex-partner." And so the thing follows his creation of these bizarre creatures in his garden shed. And he becomes friendly with a colleague at work, a much younger girl at work, who's completely just in a boring, this dead-end job. But it captured the magic of this suburban setting, but it's very fantastical as well. But in a way that is completely for me, was very original. And it is, I link it to this use of fantasy now for much more realistic purposes. What really struck me about it is in this claustrophobic, very censorious artistic environment, there was no attempt to relate to the hackneyed things of race, trans issues, colonial guilt, blah, 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 far right, all that. It was none of that. The thing, nevertheless, is quite political in a sense because it's got trapped lives and the real world that a lot of us live in suburbs and visiting these places, with kids all work in them, etc., etc. So it seemed to me, to really then link with other ideas I've got about how this is an area that is just so underexplored in particularly contemporary fiction and writing, which is still so based around the ideas of identity, so-called identity, particularly around immigration, how difficult it is to bring a kid up in a mixed race marriage in North London, yawn, all this stuff. And this seemed to be on a different, completely happy to exist in a world where you weren't referencing this. And yet, obviously, has struck a huge chord because it's been a huge hit. So as much as anything else, how often is it you'll see a TV thing and think a series and not feel, oh God, not another adaptation of Great Expectations with, the one I saw recently, the Jaggers played by Black. It's just, you're almost meant to react and think, what's wrong with that? Well, it's just becoming so narrow and cliched.
Yeah, I mean,
so that's kind of an intro to it, really.
Well, the thing that struck me was that going back over my life and that, well, I don't watch much television now, really, apart from cookery shows. But how much of sitcom, and even when it was like, yeah, sitcom, but had a dark edge, was about suburbia, or about,
Yeah.
some of the dimensions that you mentioned, like, Reginald Perrin, and, Rising
Yeah.
Damp, and The Good Life, and I could go on and on. I mean, they're springing into my mind now, over and over. It's like, but at some point there was a departure from that, and that kind of like North London thing, or whatever it was that you described, became predominant. Not having seen Small Profits, I do want to, because that definitely marks a break with so much of what would had become just kind of the trend, the dominant set of themes.
That's brilliant that you mentioned Reginald Perrin. I was obsessed with that when I was a kid, and we all watched it together as a family. And
Mm.
because it's very melancholy, actually, it's got a suicide in it, but it's a fake suicide. Again, it links to the idea of people disappearing, literally the disappearance.
Yeah.
And then he comes back as this hilarious guy, and the happiness with portraying that bland world. But of course, it's not bland. It's actually wonderful. Most of us, a lot of us, come from suburbia. I came from, I was born in central London, but actually brought up mostly in Welwyn Garden City to start with, which is the classic place that doesn't belong anywhere really. And yet I've got wonderful memories of it. It's a very strong identity. And I don't know what it was, but there came this shift to be a kind of London and all the big cities and the psychogeography of all that, and almost a sort of anxiety about the tedium of suburbia. And it's mixed with this idea of us becoming this multicultural society, and this frankly very boring use of all that in TV dramas, where something like Rise and Fall of Reginald Perrin, all those sitcoms, and also the earlier Doctor Who's, everything like that was far happier with suburbia and far happier with where most of us lived. And the boredom, which is often not boring, and Python do this all the time as well, using the everyday, but not in the sneering way that it'll be done now. So I know some more recent comedies have done it, but there's also always a bit of a patronising edge to it, and it's more uneasy in a sense because, of course, one thing that's massively happened, and I want to talk about, is how satire now is really difficult to do. And in some ways, I think we could talk about that. Why does satire become so tiresome so quickly now? And that's why I think the fantasy element has taken over. I've written one about my time in teaching, and it links to that. I sent it to a publisher. He's liked it. He said, "Well, the thing is, satire, it just doesn't work anymore. Satire." And I was thinking, and he's probably right, actually, saying, satire doesn't sell anymore, and it's. I think the satirical intent is fine, but why is that? And I think one of the obvious reasons is. Satire needs a firm bedrock. It needs a sort of established sense that there's something there you can all rail against. We don't have that anymore at all. We just don't have that sense of bedrock stability. I would argue that the kind of the labour movement we have now, the government, the new establishment, is very much this intolerant so-called progressive elite. But it's very fragile, and then they themselves are not happy in their own skins. They have replaced in some ways the old Buffton Tufton sort of gin and tonic golf club type, if it ever existed, type British establishment. But it's not the sort of thing that can be satirised in the same way. I mean, Harry Enfield, Paul Whitehouse do it brilliantly, Catherine Tate, etc. But I think generally it's there's a sense we are so anxious now, and we are so clearly in a system falling apart, that satire almost seems like, well, that's light relief, and is not biting. It's actually not as bad as the reality.
Yeah, I mean, I find that satirical, whether it's literature or TV or whatever it happens to be, from the past, I'm a few years younger than you, but we're the same generation. I find
Mm.
with younger people that I encounter and work with or whatever, just basically don't get it when it comes to some of this stuff. It really has to be kind of set out, and even then, it's kind of like, okay, but yeah, what are you saying?
Yeah. And I think obviously one always forgets when talking about this how technology is driving so much, and how obviously the social media world and everything, and the attention span, etc., etc. And in a sense, what you're getting with small profits and you have with Detector is it's slowed down massively. So actually, you're focusing on really kind of slower things, and it is not trying to um, go for quick laughs, etc. And it's particularly important to bear in mind, I think, with small profits, it's not really a sitcom at all. I mean, it's funny, very funny, but the humour is really the situational one of him working this awful. We've all been in them, and you walk in them; they're incredible. I was recently trying to fix a wall. Went into my local MFI or whatever it is, one of those places, they are incredible when you walk in, because firstly, the first thing happens with me when I walk in, I completely forget what I was there for. And then there's this massive disorientation because these huge, great avenues and towering stuff everywhere. There's always piped stuff going on, music or announcements. And then there's just like a fantasy of all the different worlds you could inhabit with kitchens, shower units. And you're there to fix, like, we've got this awful wall that keeps leaking, or it's ceiling and then the wall, and we're trying to repaint it. And you see this fantasy of incredible perfection around you. And then you think, oh God, I've got to get this. There's such a variety you could purchase. To find someone that can help you, and this character in Small Profits, Michael, is hilarious because there's a great scene. It's okay if I do a spoiler here. If anyone watches it, it'll ruin it for them.
Well, they can skip ahead if they're bothered by that.
Well, there's a great scene where he's standing, and people just stand around seemingly doing nothing, even though you can never find anyone. So he's standing in front of an absolutely mammoth great Hadrian's Wall, if not the Great Wall of China, of buckets, just one on top of another. And a guy comes up to him and says, I'm looking for a bucket. And he goes, oh, no, there's no call for them anymore. We don't sell buckets. And the guy's like, what? He goes, yeah, no, no, they're done away with. No one has buckets anymore. He's like, you serious? He goes, yeah. He goes, well, how's water moved around? He goes, oh, it's all in pipes now. It's all pipes. We don't need the buckets anymore. And he's like, what? And the buckets are right behind him, so it's brilliant. I'm ruining it a bit. But so you think, just look at the buckets. And then the Mackenzie Crook character comes out. Did you just tell us we don't sell buckets anymore? He goes, yeah. And he goes, what's that behind you? It's like, and it's that kind of incredible sense of the madness lurking underneath it as well. Is brilliant. Brilliantly observed. So he's really good at these workplaces. Anyone who's worked in an open plan office, which is like the office, or I haven't worked in one of these horrible things, but the incredible mixture of boredom and sort of shininess, and I don't know, they're incredible. They're like garden centres as well, which I always find very eerie and bizarre. And it links to the Ballard world. I think we talked about on one of the podcasts we did before.
No, yeah, absolutely, we did, and we'll get to that as well. The whole, sort of edgelands kind of thing, and these the weird artificial environments.
Yeah, this is classic edgeland. He lives in a cul-de-sac on a kind of edgeland, and it's really beautiful actually the way. But at the same time, most people would think, "What the hell? It's so boring. Why can't we be?" in the dock, why can't we be in Borough Market? Why can't we be in these places? And one thing I wanted to sort of scattergun over this is that I watch a huge amount on YouTube, and there's a guy my wife and I have been watching called John Rogers, who's a kind of Ian Sinclair, a friend of his, and he does walks with him. And they're all around the London area with a few exceptions. But they are the very well-trodden thing of the ley lines, going around bits of London with old maps, the layering, and it's wonderful stuff. But actually the ones I love are when he goes to Pinner, or he goes to some place on the some outer bit of the North Circular, some really bland bit of Middlesex or something. And the reason for that is it's just got so much less of this, frankly, cod historical. Well, it's not cod historical, it's very interesting. But at the same time, you sort of feel it's become, I don't know, just very curated. It's not really where many of us live. You get this sense that in the edgelands, where there's vast areas no one talks about. Literally no one talks about. Well, they do increasingly now, but it's still neglected comparatively.
Yeah, a couple of things for listeners who are not familiar. Edgelands, we're talking about here as kind of a zone between the urban and the rural. We kind of like, industrial states and things that tends to be on the edge of towns and cities. There's a book by the same name, a book of the same name by Paul Farley and Michael Simmons Roberts, which came out a few years ago. And you mentioned the term psychogeography, and you also mentioned, what was his name? Ian Sinclair. So these are things that people can look up if they want to familiarize themselves with the kind of what we're talking about here. But that's something that's that's always fascinated me, as you say, not much spoken about areas which most of us don't live.
Yeah, and there's great beauty to it as well. There's a Coventry painter, I can never remember his name, who paints housing estates and things like that. And maybe it's because I was brought up in that sort of environment, but to me, especially at dusk, there's enormous. And you'll see the odd bit of in a little football pitch or something, and lots of lights, and something about that. America particularly has this as well, and they're more at home with it in a sense. With us, I think because of the great kind of, we've got so much history and everything, but it's increasingly curated. And, so this guy, John Rogers, I mentioned, who's worth checking out. He's on YouTube, and he does these wonderful walks, but he's very, very besotted with lost rivers. And, lost lines of this or that, which is great up to a point. But I don't know if I'm getting this across, but it increasingly to me has been done to death. And this is why I think there's a huge hinterland, a great unexplored continent of all these places that people just think, oh, God, that's so boring. It's awful. Oh, my God, that town. But yeah, so many people live there, So many people live in places which a lot of people go through and think, oh, it's the most boring suburb imaginable, oh my God.
Well, this has a lot of relevance to the podcast that I did just prior to this with Michelle Horsley. And basically we were talking about our current ways of living, in industrialized civilizations in the West, and how that's going away one way or another. And we talked about, suburban sprawl and kind of the folly of that. And, particularly more pronounced in North America, as you say, US and Canada and places like Australia, more so even than in the UK. So I don't know to what extent any of the writers, filmmakers, whatever, if we're talking about small profits, to what extent you might be able to answer this if you looked into it, that their thinking is kind of partly informed by that. This is kind of a way of being and a way of living that has got a time limit on it, and it's drawing short.
Well, that's right. I think we all feel we're going through some massive. And maybe this, we all feel we're going through some sort of almost an end game at the moment. Yeah, I don't think that's too, but with age that will come. But I've got a 16-year-old daughter, who's happy as Larry, really, and being brought up in a fairly boring suburb of Oxford, which is a much nicer place than a lot. But the capturing this in art, or capturing it in literature in particular, and particularly in poetry, is virtually. I mean, there's been a tendency in poetry. I can talk about that because Ian Sinclair was originally a poet, of course, and there's bound to be that because people are going to think, well, look, let's go to the East End of London. We've got Jack the Ripper. We've got all this stuff. Well, we've got some anonymous place. What are you going to talk about? And the great gap with all this. The person who really explored this, I think, I've mentioned him once and we've talked about it, is Ballard, the latter Ballard anyway. So the early Ballard starts science fiction-y. high rise, but towards the end, this is the territory he inhabited. And the one thing I think Ballard can really, well, more than one thing, but Ballard is a wonderful poet of boredom as well in terms of his fiction. There's a wonderful quote from him I found. I used to teach Crash. You familiar with the Crash and the film Crash?
Absolutely, yeah, very much so, yeah. Yeah,
Cronenberg.
a huge fan of Cronenberg anyway. In fact, it was Cronenberg that led me to Ballard.
Oh, great. Well, of course, that was, extraordinary idea of the sort of psychosexuality of car crashes and these weirdos sort of turning up early, and that is that area outside of central London towards Heathrow Airport, and that becomes Ballard land, really, the great world of enormous now Amazon type warehouses, huge, great, bizarre mix of sudden bits of rural land. And Ballard's latter fiction, there was an interview before, and he was asked, what do you think about the future? What's the future going to hold? And most people, even writers, are talking about the future. They wouldn't say this. And he said, well, there's one word that'll sum up the future, and it's boredom, absolute boredom. And he was just talking about how a tedium is going to take over, and how, it was effectively already the virtually all, he was talking about all the art, and it was an attempt to escape from boredom. And I think one of the points about the stuff, the Office stuff, that's where people were first to seen the writer of Small Profits, Mackenzie Crook, one of the main characters in it. And that is really brilliant at capturing the utter tedium, but the strange drama as well, and beauty and interest of these offices in Slough in that case. And boredom is, one of the great unacknowledged legislators of the world, really. And most human beings are bored a lot. And that doesn't mean I'm criticizing anyone. Boredom is an essential part of life to spur interest, And I think one of the great criticisms of so many TV dramas, there's too much happening. There's too much melodrama. There's too much kind of bang, bang, bang. And it's even more true of modern cinema, which can be totally unwatchable, really. I like a real good dose of virtually nothing happening. And
if people say to me that they're bored, I'm saying, how can you be? Because we haven't figured out how life on Earth started, or how life started. So get on, look at that. Maybe if you're bored.
I think boredom is, but I think there is this issue with the excess becoming so over the top. Like I said, when you walk into an MFI or one of these super stores, home bargains, even, which isn't for DIY stuff, there's so much. You feel oddly very depressed, and this is gonna you get people like, you try living in bloody some hellhole where there's nothing. Oh, I totally agree, and that's going to sound very, oh my goodness, complacent. But you just have to be honest with it, how you feel about these environments that so many British people will live in. I'm not denying there's people who don't have anything, but on the whole, most of us, because these places are quite cheap as well, it's incredible what you can pick up in home bargains. Rubbish, but and to me, the way out of all this is the creation of some sort of mythology around it, not self-consciously, but this has been going on for quite a long time in literature as well. Trying to create a sort of sense of, and that's why fantasy as a genre is so powerful. And what's really died a death is the kind of the modern literary novel of manners and sort of so-and-so having an affair with so-and-so or whatever, or the campus novel and all that stuff just seems hopelessly kind of, who cares,
Yeah, you mentioned in our sort of pre-interview correspondence, Evelyn Waugh's book, Evelyn Waugh, Decline and Fall, which I've never read. Yeah. But that sounds very funny. Equally, as you mentioned yourself, I can't imagine that now. And again, we might have to say a word about the plot there for listeners who are not familiar.
Yeah, well, Evelyn Waugh's first satirical novel, or first novel, is Decline and Fall. I mean, obviously, the title Decline and Fall references Gibbon, I think it is, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And Even Wall wrote it in the 1920s. It's a novel based around an undergraduate at Oxford who gets sent down from Oxford, which means chucked out in really unfair circumstances. And so it's a brilliant satire to start with of an Oxford college. And, you know, I was talking about satire. So Waugh himself had been at Oxford and had been a quite disgraceful student, not quite sent down, but could have been. And anyway, this is the classic Waugh character, a totally innocent student who is not indulging in all the hijinks of the Bullingdon Club people may have heard of, which is the notorious one that various prime ministers and stuff were involved with.
Yeah, I've actually podcasted about that with.
In the Bullingdon Club. But Paul Pennyfeather is walking across the front quad of his college, and the novel opens with the senior figures in the college delightfully listening into everything being smashed up in a room and laughing about how there'll be huge fines. And the chaplain says, you know, pray God they attack the chapel, there'll be even more fines. And Paul Pennyfeather's walking across the quad, and he happens to be wearing a tie that's a bit like the Bollinger Club tie, which is meant to be the Bullingdon. And guy sees him and says, here's a dreadful man wearing a tie, and he's not in our club. So they strip him naked, and he runs back to his room. And he's sent down then for running around the college naked, as if he's some sort of pervert almost. And he can only get a job then. He's been sent down, and he's an orphan basically with a guardian. And his guardian refuses to give him his inheritance, says you'll have to go and make your own way until you're 21. So he goes and gets a job in an absolutely appalling third-rate public school, in other words, a fee-paying school in North Wales. And really, the most of the satire is directed around that and this absolutely terrible school where he's just thrown in. So it's a very funny satire and teaching, not the sort of teaching I did, I have to say, because that was a state school. But there's two characters in it who he becomes very friendly with. One is an appalling character called Grimes, who's basically a pederast, as it would have been called. He's always being sacked from teaching jobs. It's kind of disguised, but he's clearly got a very odd interest in young boys. And then another one is a religious nutjob who's the chaplain of the school. And but Paul Pennyfeather in it is the sort of innocent abroad who, I don't want to give the whole thing away, but there's a sequence of very picaresque events that rapidly move through various social upsets. So he actually ends up running off with the mother of one of the kids there, who is involved in what was once called the white slave trade. So she's basically, she's a very rich woman, but she's procuring girls for prostitution, although it's never identified as explicitly that, but it's clearly that's what's happening. And the novel follows his escapades through various things. He ends up in prison at the end, and the characters keep recurring. So it's a wonderful romp through 1920s England or Britain, and social satire, very savage as well.
And why not possible now, to quote yourself? That concludes part 1 of the show. To listen to part 2, visit legalize-freedom.com and scroll down the homepage to choose your membership.
legalizefreedom.com